Good evening, everybody. Well, at least it's evening for me. Um, Today we are going to hop right into Chapter 4 of OK for Now. As a quick recap, also from the Corrections Department, thank you, Mrs. Smith, for pointing this out to me. But last week, she brought it to my attention that I said that the librarian, actually, no, she said that I referred to the woman on Doug's route as Miss Merriam, which that is not the case. Miss Merriam is actually the name of the librarian. Mrs. Windermere is the name of the woman from Doug's route, Mrs. Windermere. Last time we read, as our quick recap before we get in, if you guys can remember, Doug went to his orientation at his school. He was introduced for the first time to Principal Petey. If you guys notice, Principal Petey likes to refer to himself in the third person, which is kind of a cool thing. And I think I might start calling myself Mr. Hart from now on whenever I refer to myself. We also found out Doug was very much getting into his route. Things started to be going really well for Doug, but then all of a sudden, Doug discovers that there's been a burglary at the Spicer Deli, and the top suspect is Doug's brother. And at that point, everyone in the town who was at first treating Doug very well, now all of a sudden is treating Doug very poorly because everybody suspects that Doug's brother is the culprit behind the burglary. Everybody except, of course, Mr. Ferris, who is Doug's science teacher, who pulls Doug aside and says, "Hey, bud, just so you know, in this classroom, you are not your brother." And that clearly meant a lot to Doug. Doug also really is continuing his painting or his drawings in this last episode. He's drawing a lot with Mr. Powell. And unfortunately, though, one time when he goes up, he discovers that one of the pages in the book has been ripped out and has been sold, which is very concerning to Doug. And we're going to see if we can learn more about that today. So with that, guys, we have Chapter 4, The Black-Backed Gull, plate CCXLI. And there's our picture. I always do that as if you guys can't see the picture yourselves, but oh well. Let's read, shall we? That left foot has to feel like it's in the water. In it, Mr. Switek, not in front of it. You want to give the impression of depth. I know this stupid foot is in the stupid water, I said. So how does Audubon help you to know it? He changes the color of the foot. How else? The lines aren't as sharp. Exactly. The whole form on the foot starts to blur. The texture fades away. You can't even see the webbing between the two toes. So how do I... Take your pencil and we'll lighten the strokes here and bend them just a bit, since light is bent when it enters the water. Now follow my hand. You think this is easy? I'm not lying, it isn't. I've been working on that large build puffin all September, and most of the time I was working on that stupid fading foot, because an artist doesn't draw two-dimensionally, in case you didn't know. An artist draws three-dimensionally on a two-dimensional surface, which Mr. Powell pointed out to me, and which I pointed out to Lil Spicer. How do you know that? She asked. You have to be an artist to know. And if you think she said, then how do you know? Or something snotty like that. She didn't. Figure out why she didn't. Things at Washington Irving Junior High School were mostly okay. Mostly. Nothing happened in geography, the story of the world, which was good because Mr. Barber checked on my book every time he passed down the aisle drinking a huge cup of coffee. I think he didn't care that I was turning in my answers to the review questions at the end of the chapters because that meant I wasn't messing up his new geography book. Mr. McElroy had been showing us film strips about the barbarian hordes of Russia with records that gave little pings to let him know that he was supposed to advance the strips. You can't believe how many film strips there are about the barbarian hordes of Russia. Miss Cowper still hadn't made us start that stupid Jane Eyre, so we still had all 160 pages to look forward to. Not that it mattered because I wasn't going to read it. Mrs. Verne hadn't called on me yet when I raised my hand, but she had called on me when I didn't raise my hand so that she could trip me up and show everyone what a chump I was. But I figured that's what she was up to, so when she asked if I knew what a quadratic equation was when she thought that no one in the room knew except for her, I did know. I hadn't pulled any fuzzy business either in Coach Reed's PE class. No sirree buster. Except that I did sneak over to the shirts team from the skins team when we finally played basketball after 2 weeks of dribbling and shooting drills. And in Mr. Ferris's class, Lil and I had completed our first lab report together on creating supersaturated solution, which meant that I got to do all the smelly chemically stuff, and Lil got to take down all the notes as we went and write it up. Oh, and I don't mean to brag or anything, but that lab report that Lil and I turned in for that supersaturated solution, well, let's just say that Mr. Ferris started Clarence rocking when he saw it. But I still couldn't get that left foot of that dang large-billed puffin right. It always looked like it was in front of the water. But I worked on it all weekend when my brother wasn't around, which was most of the time, and when my father wasn't around, which was all the time. I even showed it to my mother, but you can't trust mothers to tell you the truth about stuff like that. They just tell you how good it is and what a great artist you are and how you don't know where you got that type of talent from since no one else in the family could draw. But I still couldn't get that foot right. So on Saturday night, after my mother and I ate 4 thawed hamburgers and 1 large bowl of Italian macaroni salad, I decided to try some inspiration, which is something that every artist needs. So I went downstairs to the basement and got Joe Pepitone's jacket and I put it on. And then I went back upstairs to my room and rolled out the paper and tried to fade the foot into the water. Because an artist has to know how to give an impression of death, you might remember. And so then I started to get it. I really did. And then my brother came home and upstairs and into our room. And first he said, "How come you're wearing a jacket when..." And then he saw the drawing of that large-billed puffins. And then he laughed because he wouldn't know a decent drawing if it walked up to him and punched him in the face. And then he grabbed it like the jerk he is and he looked at it and he laughed again. And he said, "Can't you even draw a foot right? It looks like it's underwater, Duggo." And then he tore up that drawing and he ran away. "I guess you'll have to try it again." And then he scattered all the pieces onto my bed because that's what twisted criminal minds do. Then, still laughing, he left, not even noticing that I had Joe Pepitone's jacket on. The chump. Which, of course, I was glad about, since it was a pretty close call. I went back to the basement and I hung it up beneath the stairs again. And you know what? I was smiling. I was smiling like all get out. And if you were paying attention back there, you know why I was smiling. This is a point, folks, where if I was reading aloud to the class, I would ask, did anyone pick up why he was smiling right now? What made him happy? What did his brother say? And I'd go around a little bit and I'd maybe pick a couple of you guys at random. But I'm just going to tell you guys now. Did you guys figure it out? All right. He's happy because his brother said it looks like it was underwater. And that's exactly what he was trying to do. So even though he ripped it up, he knows that his brother thought that the drawing looked like the feet were underwater, and that's what he wanted. Let me get back to this. Sorry. So on the first Saturday of October, after a week when Mr. McElroy had enough of the Russian hordes and had probably run out of pinging film strips anyway, and so we're now headed across the Great Wall into China, and a week when Mrs. Verne finally did call on me when I had my hand up, and when I answered right, not to brag after all, that it was negative X and not negative Y, and also a week when I snuck over to the Shirts team again and Coach Reen couldn't figure out why his platoon system wasn't working and how someone was pulling funny business on him, I went over to the Marysville Free Public Library after my deliveries, all ready to tell Mr. Powell that I had figured out how to give the impression of death. Mrs. Marion, with her loopy glasses, looked up when I came in. "He's in a meeting," she said. "Is he done soon?" I said. "He's in a meeting, that's all I know. It's not like I memorized his schedule. I'm just supposed to do all this cataloging by myself now, I suppose." So I went up to see the large-billed puffins. Maybe I ought to give them names since it felt like we'd gotten to know each other. But once again, they were gone, just like the Arctic tern. And this time the page was turned to a dying bird. And I mean really dying. Most of the pictures were just of one wing held straight up. All its feathers were spread out, and you couldn't see how the Audubon got their pattern down. 3 rows of long, overlapping dark feathers, tipped white on their ends. You could feel how the wind would cruise over them. It was so beautiful, and it's what you looked at first. And then you looked down at that second wing, which was crushed. And then you looked at that belly of the bird, which was spouting thick red blood all over the dark feathers. And then you looked beneath the bird, where the blood was in a puddle. And then you looked at the bird's heel, and after that, well, that's all you looked at. I would have given Joe Pepitone's jacket to save that bird at that moment. His beak was wide open and his tongue was stretched to a point. He was screeching while his blood ran. His head was pulled back, far back, like he was taking one last look at the sky and he would ever fly it in again. And his round eye told you that he had everything was ruined forever. It was a horrible picture, and I couldn't stop looking at it. I was still looking at it when Mr. Powell puffed up the stairs after his meeting. He came over to the bird and took off his glasses, and he rubbed his eyes. And just so you know, he didn't have his glasses on a loop because I had finally told him how dumb that looks. Mr. Powell, this bird's dying! As if anyone needed to point that out. He nodded and he put his glasses back on. That's how Audubon got all the specimens. For some reason, he wanted to show that the black gull after he had shot it. He leaned against the case. What happened to the puffins? I said. I want you to work on this gull now. You see how Audubon has combined some of what we've worked on before. When he stretches out his wing, the bird seems to still like the large-billed puffins, but the bottom half of its body in one movement, like the Arctic tern. Not like the tern, I said. No, not exactly. So what happened to the Arctic tern and to the puffins? Do you see how he's left the space white and blank behind the gull? He doesn't want anything to distract the eye from the outstretched wing. He doesn't even want to give the impression of death. No, said Mr. Powell. Which would be able to see if we compared the puffins to the gull. Mr. Powell nodded. So can we do that? Mr. Powell again took off his glasses and he rubbed his eyes. Again. No, we can't do that, he said. Wait, why not? Because the large-billed puffins are gone. Wait, the pages? It's sold. Sold? The puffins are gone, Mr. Switek, and the Arctic tern into an honest collector overseas, I'm told. And the red-throated diver was also sold because the Bayi thought it would make a nice picture over the fireplace in her parlor. And the brown pelican, and if you were meeting with me downstairs, you would have seen Mr. Ballard's secretary hand over a check for $2,400 made out to the town council of Marysville, and she's going to stop by tonight to get the yellow shake. You can't sell the pages of a whole book one by one. Well, that's exactly the problem. When it's an Audubon, you can. Most buyers can't afford the whole book, but they can buy one plate at a time. And if they find something low enough to cut them out into a folio. I looked back at the dying gull, at his ruined wing, and the ruined book. Wait, is it Miss Merriam who's selling? No, she doesn't have anything to do with it. And even if she doesn't show it, she is distraught about it too. The 3 trustees of the library happen to be on the town council, and sometimes the town needs money, and sometimes even for good things. They'd like to sell the whole set of books, but the other 3 volumes belong to Marysville Historical Society, and they're preserving them as they should be. Mr. Powell tapped his glasses. This is volume 3, and since Marysville Public Library is not so scrupulous as its Historical Society, this is the only volume that is missing any of its pages. They're chumps for selling them, I said. Well, there are only a few perfect sets in the entire world, Mr. Powell said quietly. And this isn't one of them now. Mr. Powell nodded. No, I guess not anymore. So let's find some paper and begin on this wing. I looked back at the eye of that dying gull who knew that everything was ruined forever because that's exactly how it always is. On Monday, Coach Reed caught me sneaking over to the shirts team and finally figured out about my funny business. He told me in his sergeant's voice that I better go with that skins team and I better not try to mess with his platoons again. No siree, Buster! I told him that I wanted to play on the shirts team and he better send someone else over to the skins team if they wanted to go. He said he'd send me over to the skins team, whoever he wanted to send over to the skins team, and Buster, that was me, so I better go. You could probably figure out that everything else in the gym had gotten pretty quiet. There was not a single dribble anywhere. I said it didn't matter who went as long as the teams were even, and I pointed out that with me on the shirts team, we'd have even numbers, so it didn't really make sense to send me to the skins team anyway. Coach Reed said that he was the teacher. I said I thought you had to be able to count to be a teacher. He said 1, 2, 3. He sure could count the 3 days of after-school detention I now had, and he wanted to know if I would like to see if he could even count higher. I said, sure, let's see how high you can count. He said, 4, 5. At that point, I started to clap. Yeah, you can count. He said 6'7", and before I could clap again, he grabbed my arm and he dragged me down the gym and through the halls of Principal Petey's office. Principal Petey, who had been waiting for this moment, who decided to stretch things out and make me sweat. He told me to sit down in that chair by the secretary, which I did in my stupid gym uniform for almost a half an hour before he opened his door and told me to come in and sit down, and said Principal Petey had been expecting something like this all along, and Principal Petey was surprised that it hadn't happened sooner, and Principal Petey was going to throw the book at me so I'd learned my lesson and learned it good, and dang it, I should take this like a man of Principal Petey and look him in the eye. He really wanted to see me sweat. "Look Principal Petey in the eye," he said. And I did. For a moment. "You're not here to look at a pelican," he said. "You're here to look at Principal Petey." And I'm not lying. If you had been there, you would have looked him in you wouldn't have looked him in the eye either. You'd have looked right past him like me. You'd have looked at that wall over his desk, and you would have seen that beautiful thing that I saw. The brown pelican. The beautiful brown pelican. The beautiful and noble brown pelican. One of the pages razored out of Audubon's book. I got 7 days of after-school detention and one more for not looking Principal Petey in the eye. But I couldn't help it. Could you? It wasn't the best day I'd had at Washington Irving Junior High School. Tuesday was a little better, even though the morning in English class we finally started reading Jane Eyre by Miss Charlotte Bronte, while we were likely to be reading for a whole while longer, since it was 160 pages long, even for an abridgment, as you might remember. For the rest of the week, though, Miss Cowper read it aloud to us. I know, you're probably thinking that we are dying of boredom. But what was kind of surprising was it wasn't so bad. I mean, by Friday, we were all at the part where Jane is in the boarding school, and this jerk who runs it, who sort of reminds me of the principal of Washington Junior High School, makes Jane stand on a stool because he wants everyone to think that she is a liar. Like she's been going over to the other team on PE or something absolutely horrible like that. So she's standing there for everyone. Everyone is supposed to stay away from her because the principal says that they should, and you think she's going to crumble and just give up. But you know what? She doesn't give up. That sort of reminded me of Lil, which I did not tell her, and which you shouldn't tell her I said that either. So the story wasn't so bad. But what was so bad was that Miss Cowper decided that the beginning next week she was going to make us take turns reading aloud. She would read for the first 5 minutes of class to give us a running start, she said, and then she would call on us in alphabetical order, I should say alphabetical victim, to read for the next 7 minutes. Terrific. So on Monday, she started with Otis Bottom, who read like he had written the thing himself. When he finished, and when he read the parts after Jane was off the stool and tried not to finish what she could get with Mr. Blockhurst, the jerk, I almost wanted to stand up and clap, because Otis Bottom was that good of a reader. Except that what I really wanted to do was throw up because he was that good. Terrific again. But when the period was almost over, Miss Cowper said, "We'll have 5 minutes of new readers tomorrow," like she was promising a gift for us or something. I figured at that point I better talk to her, because, as you remember, I wasn't going to read Jane Eyre. So I waited until everyone left, even though I thought I might be late to Mrs. Verne's class, and I knew that Principal Petey would love to see me waiting outside his office for another 30 minutes. "Miss Cowper," I said. She was putting the pages in a notebook, but she looked at me. "I don't know if I want to read Jane Eyre out loud." "Everyone takes a turn, Douglas, even if you don't think you like the book." I looked around to be sure no one was there, and the room to hear what I was about to say. No, I actually like the book well enough," I said. "So what's the problem?" What was I supposed to say? I just looked at her like a chump. "Douglas, I know Otis Bottom is a wonderful reader. It's a gift that he has. You may have different gifts, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try to read aloud." No, I know that," I said. "Is it reading aloud in front of others that bothers you?" "No." "Good, then I look forward to your gallant attempt tomorrow, when your turn comes," she said. Well, you see how it is. Sometimes things go from bad to worse. I headed to Mrs. Verne's class, looking at the next few pages of Jane Eyre. I think that Charlotte Bronte ought to be shot. I mean, who uses words like these? I didn't know half of these words. Well, most of them, at least. Okay, I'm a chump. So what? And what was I supposed to do? I thought of Jane Eyre standing on her stool and everyone looking at her. I thought of that dying Gaul from before on that painting. I hate this stupid town. there's another hint at something, guys, that I mentioned to in yesterday's reading. Another hint of something that's been foreshadowed that maybe you've learned about Doug by now. Maybe, maybe, maybe. Detention that afternoon was with Mr. Ferris because the 8th grade teachers took turns monitoring after-school detention, which probably put them in really good moods. So I stayed in his room after school and waited for the other twisted criminal minds to join me for my 90 minutes of forced study. It didn't help that it was one of those perfect blue cloudless days where the trees are starting to golden up and the breezes are cool like they were during a World Series, and you can imagine having a catch with Joe Pepitone or Horace Clark or someone like that. But instead you're sitting in that physical science room, and it turns out that you are the only twisted criminal mind, so you're all alone while Mr. Ferris works on the next lab preparation. I flipped through the pages of Jane Eyre, hopeless. Somewhere far away a dog barked, and it was a happy bark, and I flipped through Jane Eyre again, very hopeless, and Mr. Ferris looked up from his lab preparation. So, Doug Swiatek, what are you in for? Oh, I mouthed off to Coach Reed. He thought about this for a minute, his hand on Clarence. Generally, it is neither wise nor prudent to mouth off to a junior high school teacher, especially to one who is a sergeant in the United States Army. Yeah, not even if the teacher was in the wrong? Well, consider this. Is it Coach Reed or you who's now sitting here in a jury room that smells of vinegar on a beautiful October afternoon? Yeah, I guess I see your point, I said. However, since it's you and not Coach Reed, perhaps we can put this time to some good use, as you seem to have not given up on Jane Eyre. Have you ever seen the Pelican in Principal Petey's office? I said. Are you trying to illustrate the principle of randomness, Doug Swiatek? No, really. Have you ever seen it? I have. Don't you think it belongs back in the book it came from? Mr. Ferris rocked Clarence thoughtfully. I understand it was a gift to him from the council when he was appointed. So do you think it belongs back in the book it came from? Mr. Ferris smiled. In general, I adhere to the notion that things belong in the class to which they have been assigned, which leads me to the periodic table. No more about that pelican, please. He walked over to the glossy chart banging beside the chalkboard on the front wall. The periodic table arranges elements according to their physical properties and to what else? Their atomic numbers, Mr. Ferris. Good. The table also gives us the name of elements here. Hydrogen, the atomic number here, 1, the symbol here, H. I know that you know the symbol from hydrogen already, so let's see if you can learn 6 more. Look at the symbols for the inert gases. Helium, neon, argon, krypton, xenon, radon. I looked at the chart. He might as well have been speaking ancient Egyptian. All right, look at me and tell me what the symbol of the first inert gas is of helium. And at that, I shook my head. He looked back at me. Glance back at the chart and find neon and tell me what that symbol is. I looked back at the chart, but I shook my head again. Mr. Ferris looked up at me for a long time, and then he walked back to the chart and he pointed. Ne, I said. Good, now try xenon, he said. It was the atomic number of 54. Xe, I said. Good, now look over to the transitional elements. He pointed to 29. This is copper. The symbol is Cu. Good. He moved his finger down one more element. And the symbol for this one is Ag, I said. Good. He moved his finger down again. And this one? Au, I said. And this one? Hg. Good. Doug, of Au, Ag, and Hg, which is the symbol for silver? And at this, I didn't even have a guess. Ag, he said. And that was how Mr. Ferris figured out what no other teacher had figured out before in my entire life. Terrific. You guys figure it out yet? Anybody? Anyone figure it out? In the back, do you know the answer? At the end of this chapter, we'll discuss again. Actually, I'm pretty sure they're about to give you the answer, guys. So, 1 second, just seeing how much further is left here. All right, let's keep going. I think Mr. Ferris told Miss Cowper because in English class on Wednesday, we all opened up Jane Eyre and Miss Cowper read her 5 minutes, and then she called in Glenn Thomas, who was probably surprised but didn't say anything, and he got right to his reading. And Miss Cowper, you may think I'm lying here, but I'm not. Miss Cowper didn't look at me until the end of class, just before the bell was about to ring and Jane Eyre was about to leave the Lowood institution. Douglas, I looked at her. I'd been waiting for something to happen, and I figured that's what this was. Douglas, do you think that Jane Eyre should feel guilty for not being able to save Helen Burns from dying? No, I mean, it wasn't her fault. That's right, it wasn't her fault at all. There are some things in this world that we cannot fix, and they happen, and it's not our fault, though we still might have to deal with them. There are other things that happen in this world that we can fix, and that is what good teachers like me are for. A general groaning from everyone in the class, but not from me. Miss Cowper and I, we looked at each other in the eye. Maybe, I thought, maybe everything is not so ruined, after all. That day I was supposed to have my last after-school detention with Mr. Ferris again, but when I came in, he told me to report to Miss Cowper's class. How come, I said. Because I'm a mean old crank who is likely to beat you if you don't go, he said. And I think Miss Cowper's... Well, if that's the case, I better go to Miss Cowper's room, I said. Yeah, I think you better, he said, and at that point he started Clarence rocking again. Miss Cowper was waiting for me when I got there. Just the person I need, she said. She held up a batch of dittos. Their blue alcohol smell fluttered around them. I've been developing a country literacy unit, and I need a student to practice on. Would you be willing? What do I have to do? Well, you would play the part of the student who is learning how to read. Are you a little suspicious here? The student is learning how to read, I said, and she nodded. Miss Cowper, if this is because you think I don't... No. You have to show me what you've been working on with Mr. Ferris. So I set my books down on my desk, and I went up to the chalkboard, and I wrote AG. That's the symbol of silver, I said. She came up to the board and took the chalk from my hand, and she wrote silver. So is this, she said. Let's get started. And I bet Clarence was rocking at that point. I bet Clarence was rocking every day for the rest of the week and every day for the next week when I stayed after school with Miss Cowper, and not for after-school detention, just remember, but just so we could work on her county literacy unit. And I could play the part of the chump student who didn't even know how to read. At that point, she took me through the letters and the sounds that they made by themselves and the sounds that made when they were first working with one another. And then we opened up Jane Eyre and picked out words and pretty much looked impossible, but we figured it out because we were able to learn about letters and their sounds working together. No one told me stuff like this. How come no one ever told me stuff like this? How come? And by the way, in case you want to know, AU is the symbol for gold, which was a hard G and one vowel that sounds O, and HE was the symbol for mercury, which has two vowels, E and a U, even though Y is sometimes a vowel in words like my, fry, try, and cry, because every word has to have one vowel at least. Did you know that? And C is hard, not like pace or scent, which is, in this case, C is soft, but in like cure, cur, and care. How come no one ever told me stuff like this? And on Saturday morning during deliveries, I'd practice picking out new words in Jane Eyre, sounding all of the new ones I needed learning. And I'm not lying, there were plenty. A new servitude. There is something in that, I soliloquized. I mean, who talks like that? Do you know how long it takes to sound out the word soliloquies? And even after you do, you have no idea what that stupid word means because it probably just means said, which is what stupid Charlotte Bronte should have said just in the first place. And when I delivered Miss Mason's groceries, she saw that I had Jane Eyre under my arm. Oh, that is my favorite novel when I was in school. It was? I soliloquized to her. Yes? Have you gotten to the part where Bertha bites her brother and almost kills him? Mrs. Mason, I haven't gotten to anything half as good as that. Well, keep with it, you will. And that morning she gave me 3 powdered sugar donuts. 3. When Miss Loeffler saw Jane Eyre, he said, "You poor kid." Did you read this in school, Mr. Loeffler? Fortunately, I got the appendicitis in the middle of it and almost died. It was the best thing that ever happened to me. I couldn't go back to school for 3 weeks. How are you feeling reading it? Yeah, it's a new servitude, I said. If I were you, I'd start thinking about pains in my gut. When Mr. Doherty saw Jane Eyre, she said, "Do you like to read?" Yeah, it's complicated, I said. She thought for a minute or so, pushing back her kids like they were tied from a flow at the door. I'm looking for a babysitter for some Saturday nights, but you have to like reading since not a single one of these kids is going to go to sleep without a book. I looked at how many kiddos there were. I figured she must have trouble finding a babysitter if she was asking me, the brother of a twisted criminal mind. And I looked, and I counted 5 kids. 3 of them had something red dribbling out of their hands. I was afraid to ask what that red thing even was. Mrs. Doherty was probably desperate. It pays very well, she said. She was definitely desperate. Now, this is the part where I should tell you something. You know that I'm making $5 plus tips every Saturday? And we both know that's good money, right? You might remember that my father knows I'm making $5 every Saturday morning, and he thinks that's good money too. So that's why he takes it, since I'm supposed to be helping out with household expenses. It's about time, he says. And so I'm living on the tips that I don't tell my father about, which is what you would do too. Don't lie, you would definitely do that too. It's a deal, I said to Mrs. Doherty. 7 o'clock? Yep, I'll have the books waiting for you. Terrific. So I'm up at Miss Windermere's house, and everything was quiet. There was no typing, no dinging, and she came to that door when she heard me putting things away. What kind of ice cream did I order? Mint chocolate chip. That's a good kind of ice cream to eat when the god has fled, she said. I guess that means no one was holding her wings of creativity beside her desk. What's that book in your back pocket? Jane Eyre. Ah, come with me. So I put the mint chocolate chip ice cream into the freezer and I followed Mrs. Windermere to her study. She ranged over a bunch of shelves and then pulled out 3 smallish, darkish books. She handed them to me. That is the first edition of Jane Eyre. I looked at her. I guess she thought she was pretty all-fired important. A first edition, she said, all 3 volumes. Wow, I said. Skinny delivery boy, do you have any idea how hard it is to collect a first edition like that? I look over the books on the shelves in her study. It looks like you're doing pretty well. But this is Jane Eyre, one of the world's most lovely stories. It's beloved. It has love, betrayal, jealousy, the search for the true and complete self. It's worthy of a play, I'd say. And there's the god, she whispered, and she rested her typewriter. She rolled a page into it, and her hands started flying, and she already knew how. I put the first edition of Jane Eyre back on the shelf, and I slid all 3 books in carefully because I guess it was all fired important. I sounded out the words from Jane Eyre, the paperback edition, not the first edition, all the way back into town. And I stopped at Spicer's Deli for that really cold Coke that Mr. Spicer always gave me. I would have bought a pastrami sandwich if Mrs. Windermere had given me a tip, but I wasn't getting a tip anywhere because this bill was going on her tab, which you might remember, and the other tips weren't going to cover all the pastrami sandwich and leave me much of the rest of the week. And I don't want to complain or anything, but a tip would have been nice, since it was me, after all, who brought the god back to Mrs. Windermere. That afternoon, when I got to Mary's View Free Public Library, though, Mr. Powell and Lil Spicer were waiting for me. Mr. Powell was trying to get ahead of his cataloging so Miss Miriam wouldn't fuss at him, and Lil was speeding ahead on Jane Eyre. She was almost done. Terrific. We went upstairs together to work on the blackback gull, or Mr. Powell and I did at least. Lil helped by letting me know how well I was doing. Isn't there too much blood there? She said when I spread my drawing out. It gives the drawing drama. His wing is slanted off to the side. Well, that's one point of view, I said. And I think his neck is too far back. It's called composition. And on like that it went until Mr. Powell told us both to hush because he wanted to talk about Audubon's use of the white space under the wing and the contrast and the spatial perception that the 2 wings gave the artist and stuff like that. Lil hushed for a while, but then she started again before too long. And do you think I minded? Do you think I minded when she leaned in right next to me to point something out? Do you think I minded that she smelled like daisies and would smell if they were growing in a big field under a sky clearing after the rain? Do you think I minded when she touched my hand? You remember how I told you about, though, when things are going pretty good, it usually means that something bad was about to happen. And that was true. Just like in the case of the black-backed gull. About halfway through October, as I was thinking that I was starting to wear my Joe Pepitone's jacket to school because there wasn't anything else I could wear with sleeves that even pretended to reach my wrists, someone at that point broke into Tools and More hardware store. It happened on a Saturday afternoon. A Sunday afternoon, actually. The register got forced open and all the cash was taken. There was a bunch of tools gone, a chainsaw, a drill set, and a wrench set, and a bike was gone too, which made the brilliant policeman of stupid Marysville come to the conclusion that it must have been a kid who had broken in. So guess whose house they came to that Sunday night? And they didn't want any of that thawed hamburgers or German potato salad my mom offered them either. Is your son home? They asked. He's off with friends, my mother said. Is your son ever home? The police officer asked. I think he was a little upset. What's he doing with his friends? Said Mr. Doherty. Just playing, she said kind of hopefully. Mr. Doherty looked at me. Do you know where he's playing? We have a few questions and we want to make certain that he's all right. Sure, that's what they wanted. I shrugged. Thanks, you've been real helpful. We'll go look for him ourselves. And they did. And it probably didn't help that my brother, that when he saw them, he took off his Stingray and made them chase him about 10 miles. And he made them crash one. No, 2 cop cars. And finally, they had to call the state police, who ran him down when one of his tires popped because he had taken a sharp turn on one wheel, which was something only a few people knew how to do, and he was one of them. He told us all this after Mr. Doherty brought him home and sat him with us while the other policemen searched throughout our garage and basements, and afterwards asked my brother about 15 different ways if he had been inside Tools and More hardware store. I could tell the other policemen didn't believe him all 15 times. It was hard to tell with Mr. Doherty, except he said that maybe we should hold off on that Saturday night babysitting until things got cleared up. Terrific. And after they left, my mother asked my brother the same question. You already heard me tell them. Tell me now. I didn't steal anything. Did you take anything from Mr. Spicer's deli, though? No, just because what Lucas did is over and done. I'm worrying about what you're doing. You don't have to worry about anything, my brother said. I am worried. You don't believe me? My mother went into the kitchen. My brother watched her leave, and she just stood there watching her back as she worked at dishes in the sink. He stood there for a long time, and then he said something she didn't hear, and he dared me to say anything, just one little thing. And then he went upstairs. So I did my homework at the wobbly kitchen table, mostly Mrs. Verne's stuff, and copying a map of the Mississippi River from geography, the story of the world, which I want you to know was still as clean and perfect as the day Mr. McGraw-Hill sewed the front cover on. I also drew costumes on the samurai tradition of Japan, where we'd gone with Mr. McElroy after we left China. And of course, I did a few pages of Jane Eyre, who was settling on Mr. Rochester's house, even though he hadn't shown up yet. At least, I think he hadn't shown up. But I took my time. And when I finally did go upstairs and all the lights were off and my brother was in bed, the covers were drawn over my head. And you know, when someone was crying, sometimes things get left in the air. It's not because you can see or smell or feel or draw, but it's something that's there. It's like the screech of the blackback gull crying out into the empty white space around him. You can't hear it, and when you look at the picture, you can't see it either. But that doesn't mean it isn't there. The trees were reddening and yelling, and you could see the color moving like slow tide through the hills that rose through both sides of stupid Marysville. One day it was only the trees towards the top ridges, and then the next the color was coming down, first where the trees stood mostly by themselves, and then in the bigger patches of red and yellow until the green was holding out only in the cut-ins of the grass of the hills. And then the tops started to thin out, and you could see the bare rock beneath them. The red and the yellow reached the bottom of the hills, and then the trees around the top colored quickly, like they didn't want to miss the parade. Except the trees around the dump, of course. Their leaves turned brown, and then they dropped. Terrific. My mother and I raked them across the front dirt and burned them in the street. Do you know what that smells like? Oh, it's the smell of fall. Lucas used to love to play in the woods before we burned them. He'd rake them up and jump in and scatter them all and rake them up all over again and jump in them until he was covered in bits and pieces of the leaves. Then he'd come and get me and we'd burn the piles and he'd stand there all serious and still like he was watching something far away. She shifted some of the leaves closer to the low flames. Mom, he'll be back soon, I said. Oh, I know he will. I looked at her face. She was watching something far away, too. I hope there isn't any more trouble, she said. And so, you know, that's what I was thinking about in PE those days. I didn't want there to be any more trouble, mostly because my mother already had enough trouble. So I was really trying not to get another visit to Principal Petey again, even though it would almost have been worth it to see the brown pelican. But I was really trying. No funny business, no sirree Buster, not from this guy. And things were going okay, even though Coach Reed and I didn't talk much. We were finishing up the apparatus unit, which meant messing another round on the leather horses and parallel bars and ropes in the high bar, which people who are skinny and wiry like yours truly can do without breaking a sweat. Not that Coach Reed would ever say anything to me, not about that in a million years. I could have thrown a triple somersault, full layout dismount, and he wouldn't have said one compliment to me. Pretty much he just walked around the gym and he hollered at Otis Bottom at something else, and then he wouldn't talk with me, and I couldn't talk with him, and then he'd tell us to just line up in platoons, and we wouldn't even look at me. Which was fine. I had no problem with him not looking at me. Until the day he announced that he didn't feel like spotting for another hour, so we should line up, and he'd count off by 2 teams, and we played basketball, and at that moment he decided to divide us up in the shirts and skins. And I got on the skins team, and Coach Reed went to his office, and I walked over to the shirts team and asked James Russell if he'd like to trade sides. James Russell said sure, and we did, and Coach Reed must have been watching because he came back from his office, yes sirree Buster, and he was not a happy coach. He wondered what I thought I was doing. Sergeant's voice. I pointed out, and I think I pointed this out politely, that I thought I was about to play basketball. He told me, and I don't think he did this politely at all, that I should shut my mouth and get over to the skins team. It was starting to sound too familiar once again. Then James Russell said that he didn't care and he was happy to switch with me. Coach Reed told James Russell that he wasn't talking to him and he should mind his own business, and then he looked back at me and wondered if he hadn't already been through all this before and hadn't I learned anything at all. I could have said that I learned a whole lot. I could have told him I learned about the periodic table, and then I learned about Jane Eyre, and even the location of brown pelican. But I didn't say anything, which is important for you to know so that you don't blame me for what happened next. Coach Reed guessed that I hadn't learned anything at all, but he was going to give me a chance now. He told James Russell to put his shirt back on and get over to the shirts team. And when James said that he was fine on the skins team, Coach Reed gave him the kind of look that said he was going to gut him if he spoke one more word. James put his shirt on and went over to that shirts team. Sorry, he whispered, and then he walked by to me. Shut your face, Coach Red said to him. And then Coach Reed, who is the kind of person that Joe Pepitone would probably want to pound into the dirt with his baseball bat, he looked at me again. Get over to the skins team, he said. Actually, he growled it even. And I shrugged. I mean, what was I supposed to do? So I walked over to the skins team. You could see at this point that I was really trying not to get on his bad side. I looked around at the 2 teams. I think we're all smart enough to remember who's on whose team. Maybe I don't have to take my shirt off. I mean, it's not like we're gym teachers or anything. We're not that dumb. Okay. I know I told you I was really trying, but probably at that moment that sounded like a Lucas comment, didn't it? Coach Reed said, over there, now! In a kind of double sergeant's voice. Each word was slow and apart and long, carrying a whole lot of atomic weight. Are you going to shoot me if I don't go over there? I think Coach Reed crossed the floor almost without touching it, and then he said the words, who do you think you're talking to? The words filled the gym. He reached for my shoulder, but when he reached, I pulled back, and all he got was my PE uniform shirt. Maybe that was all he wanted anyways. And I don't know if it was him reaching or pulling back, but whatever it was, the whole stupid gym shirt got torn right down the whole way. And everything in that gym stopped. Again. But this time it wasn't because I was mouthing off to Coach Reed. It was because of what they saw. And what they saw, you know what? That's none of your stupid business. So I'm going to ask you guys real quick. I'm sorry to stop again like this, but what do you think you saw? I'm going to ask this as a discussion question too. So if you want to write your answer quickly, go to discussion question. It'll probably be Wednesday or Thursday, but go write your answer, then come back and finish this because I want to hear your guys' predictions. What do you think was seen under that topless Doug? It got announced that the whole stupid school in probably a minute and a half. When I walked down the hall after PE, it was like I was a circle of silence. Ahead of me, people would be talking and laughing their heads off, and then when they'd see me, they would stop talking. They'd hold their mouth shut like the funniest thing in the whole stupid world had just happened, and they wanted to bust out laughing about it, but they couldn't until I walked by. And so they'd watch until I got past them, and then they would wait a couple of seconds, and then I'd hear them start up laughing again, the stupid jerks. They'd be laughing their heads off and talking, but they'd be low enough, and I couldn't exactly hear what they were saying. Do you know what this feels like? When I got to Mr. Ferris's class, I walked in the door, and Audubon was standing with a group of guys, and he's tall, so he looked pretty threatening, and he was saying, "Shut up, just shut up." And Mr. Ferris was going over to calm things down. I guess when everyone saw me, everything went eerie quiet. Mr. Ferris looked around for a second, then said, "Let's all sit down and get started." Except that I turned around and I just walked out. And he came to the door and he walked after me, and I started running. And he started running too. And we reached the doors of Washington Junior High School at the same time. And he grabbed that bar handle, and I couldn't stop. He grabbed that bar handle of the door, so I couldn't open it. And the next, and I reared back, and it hit him at that moment, I hit him in the stomach as hard as I could. And I knew what was going to happen. After school detention for life, but I didn't care. I punched him again. And he grabbed my arm. So by this point, I was crying. So what? So what? And he walked me over to the school library. He slammed the auditorium doors. The shout of the Washington Irving Junior High School brass band quintet was so loud that they had to stop. They'd have to go to practice somewhere else now, which they did in a hurry. He pushed me down in an auditorium's chair, and he sat next to me, and he said, "Tell me." I tried to get up, and he pushed me back down, and he said again, "Tell me." And so I did. I told him how my father came home late one night on my 12th birthday, and how he'd missed everything because he'd been with Ernie Echo. How he missed my birthday, how he sounded when he told my mother, when my mother told him that. How he came up into my room with a beer on his breath, and he told me that we were going someplace special for my birthday present, and I should get dressed right now. How I said he didn't have to, and he smacked me, and he said he better not have to tell me again. And then he took me past my mother, who at this point was no longer smiling. How he got into the beery car, and he gunned it, and said, "Hadn't I said I wished I would have a tattoo just like Lucas did? Didn't I tell him that?" And I nodded because I was afraid not to tell him that. And then we arrived at the mostly dark place, and we got out of the car, and I said I wanted to go home, but he looked at me with a beer in his eyes, and he said, "I better get in there." And so I did. And then I laid down on the couch, and my father talked with the guy, and they laughed and laughed because my father covered my eyes with bare hands because this was a present, and he was picking out a real surprise for me. And then that fat, sweaty guy bent over me, and I could smell him, and I could feel him close when he pulled up my shirt. And then I could feel it as he began giving me the tattoo. And I said it hurt, and my father pushed me down with his hand over my eyes and said, "I better be still if I knew it was good for me." And so I did go still, even though at that point I was crying too. How even when it was done, after a long time, I would look in the mirror and I saw the scroll and I saw the flowers that they put on my side and the words that I couldn't read at the time, but the flat, sweaty guy read for me. He put a tattoo on me that said "Mama's Baby." And I told Mr. Ferris how they both laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed. The funniest thing in the whole stupid world. Mama's baby. And I told him how I spent days trying to wash it off. And then I tried scratching it off until it began to bleed. And I told him how I hadn't gone swimming since then. How I changed PE in the locker room stalls. How I wished he would. Mr. Ferris didn't say one thing the whole time. He just sat next to me and he listened. And when I finished, I looked at him. And at that moment, he was crying. I'm not lying. He was crying too. I don't think it was because of how hard it hit him either. I don't think he was crying because I hit him too hard. I know how the blackback gull feels when he looks up in the sky. I think it's somehow the way Mr. Ferris felt at that moment too. And that's it, guys, for chapter 4. Definitely a big reveal here. Did anyone guess that it was a tattoo? Did anyone also guess that Doug was not able to read? And that was, there were definitely foreshadowing throughout the book. I'm wondering if you guys caught any of the foreshadowing throughout, but there were a lot of little subtle hints. I will definitely be asking in the next couple days, so please go to the forum and answer those questions. I want you guys to think about how powerful that was for Mr. Ferris, literally taking punches from a student and allowing himself to get punched and just sitting there and listening, and how great that was for Doug to hear. I also want you to think about how awful that was that his dad made him get such a tattoo, and how literally scarring that would be for a kid. A lot of other stuff to think about in this chapter as well. It's great stuff with Mr. Powell, with Mom. One thing from last chapter that I didn't mention, if you can remember, Lucas has sent a letter to Mom, so that's in the back of Mom's mind. She knows that Lucas is going to be home soon, but if you can recall, Lucas did not write the letter, and he also warned that he would not quite be his full self. So I want you guys to think about that as well. So Lucas, remember, he is going to be coming home from the Vietnam War, but he is not quite himself. So I want you to think what that could possibly be, why he would not be himself. With that, guys, I got to get to bed. It's pretty late on my end, but I hope you guys are still having a wonderful quarantine here. Please, guys, stay safe, stay busy, okay? Have fun. And with that, guys, everybody take care. Have a good one.